Salam, Sanbonani, Molweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, Hetepu, and welcome to this Sunday's edition of The People's Voice with your host, Shabnam Palesa Mohamed, your producer and presenter for Salam Media, humanitarian journalism portal and platform. We're broadcasting live from Teguini, Durban, KZN, South Africa. And tonight, we're in conversation with Judge Yasmin Shehnaz Mir, as well as Nishan Belton, the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Before we begin, I want to pay a moment of tribute to Nathaniel Julius and all victims of police brutality and state repression in South Africa and around our world. Before I introduce our first guest to the People's Voice, I want to help you tune in to a critical conversation tonight. So you can comment, question, ask our guests questions, share your ideas, and here's how we do it. You can watch live via the Salam Media Facebook page. You can also watch live via the Salam Media YouTube channel. And you can listen live via the Salam Media website, the Salam Media or TuneIn app, and of course, all free-to-air decoders. I'm about to start a watch party from the Salam Media page so that everyone on my networks is going to be able to enjoy and join this conversation this evening. All right, there we go. And it's as easy as that. You can start a watch party as well from the Salam Media page so that all of your friends, families, and colleagues can join in this conversation this evening. All right, we're going to introduce into studio Judge Yasmin Shehnaz Mir. And just to tell you about her while we bring her into studio, our topic for this discussion is going to be revolutionary women. Professor Fatima Mir, of course, one of the most powerful political and iconic activism figures in our history. And I am very humbled that we share a birthday on the 12th of August. And of course, we could not let August pass without a tribute to Professor Fatima Mir. Joining us as our guest to talk about her life and the lessons we learned from her is the second daughter of human rights activist, academic, author, and creator, Professor Fatima Mir. Judge Yasmin Shehnaz Mir is also the Land Claims Court for South Africa, as well as a Western Cape High Court judge. She's going to be joining us via a telephonic interview this evening, and Sadiq is going to bring her into studio in a minute. Assalamu alaikum, Judge Shehnaz Mir. Welcome to the People's Voice.
Wa alaikum salam, and good evening to you and all your listeners.
It's indeed an honor to have you join us today. I know you're very, very busy, Judge Mir, so we're going to get straight into the conversation. There are a multitude of connected views in books and online about Professor Mir's legacy and her ability to ignite the imagination of people who want to build a better country and a better world. What do you believe were her most significant contributions in her lifetime? And as a follow-up question, what inspired her growing up?
My mother was a courageous, selfless, independent-minded scholar and social activist, and all her contributions must be seen in this context. She cared deeply for humanity and humankind. She was a fearless champion of rights of the poor and the underprivileged, both in pre- and post-apartheid South Africa. This resulted in numerous banning orders, house arrest, imprisonment, and even post-94, she continued the good fight on behalf of the poor and marginalized, for whom the rights enshrined in the Constitution were not a reality. So I think that in a nutshell is her contribution. I think it also has to be said that she broke through all barriers. She knew no glass ceiling and did not let her gender define her or prevent her from achieving her goals or from being, as she was aptly described, the courageous, selfless, independent-minded scholar. Now, I know I sound like a daughter who's overpraising her mother, but my mother truly was a remarkable human being, and we were very privileged and honored to be her children.
Absolutely agree with you. I don't think there's enough praise in the world to reflect the reality of her, the impact she's made in our country and around the world. Judge Mir, what influenced her and inspired her growing up? I know she started very early, probably before the age of 17.
Yeah, she made her first political speech, which is very difficult to, I mean, it's actually defies imagination, but she was a 17-year-old girl when she got up on a podium. It was during the Defiance campaign in Durban, and she made her first political speech. What inspired her? I think she was inspired by the struggles against injustice, certainly internationally and nationally. A great inspiration and encourager was her father, Musa Mir, who was a journalist, and her father's brother, Ahmed Mir. So she had these very strong men. Sorry? She had these two very strong, if you like, patriarchal figures who nurtured her and thrust her forward in a way that most women of her generation were not being thrust into the limelight.
Very important to have that idea of gender equality and wanting to make that difference. Certainly, she's influenced many women and young girls in our country and around the world. Now, as a sociology academic and a published author of over 40 books, many of those under the Institute for Black Research, which she founded, her contributions in these critical areas of knowledge are profound, both nationally and internationally. Can you share more with us?
My mother was an academic at the University of Natal for many, many years. And in her capacity as such, she influenced and nurtured generations of students who had the privilege to be taught by her. She taught both in South Africa and internationally at a time when very few South African academics were on the world stage. As you said, she's authored some 40 books. I think that the earliest and quite well-known one is something called Portraits of Indian South Africans. Then there was a seminal study on suicide and race, which actually she did for her master's degree, and that was subsequently published. Another well-known publication was The Apprenticeship of a Mahatma, which was about the life of Mahatma Gandhi. The message of that book really was said to India, you gave us Mohammed Karamchand Gandhi, a lawyer, and we gave the world a Mahatma. So it was all about Gandhi transitioning from this lawyer into this great Mahatma. And interestingly enough, that particular book has been made into a film produced by the illustrious director Shyam Benegal. Then you have various publications. There was Documents of Indentured Labor, which told the story of indentured laborers coming on from the ship list, coming to South Africa. Recently, a compilation of her writings was published by the Human Science Research Council. So, you know, the list goes on and on and on, and many of these books were published under the Institute for Black Research at a time when research by Blacks about Blacks was very important.
Absolutely agree with you. And of course, there was the only authorized biography of Nelson Mandela called Higher Than Hope. Absolutely brilliant. What an author and an academic. So
That's
from there,
right.
Judge Noor,
yes.
I'd like to talk about her being a champion for social justice. It's one of her most well-known roles, and she wore many caps, but perhaps none better than that one. She was a champion for social justice, especially for our poor, our downtrodden, and our oppressed. Please share with us why and how.
Well, I think I've told you something about the why. Let's talk about the how. How did she do this? there was not a struggle by poor people that she did not play a role in. I remember when I was growing up, there were the Tin Town floods in Durban. Tin Town was an area where poor Indian people lived in tin shacks, literally. And I recall not only my mother, but both my parents actively going out there and being involved and trying to, help the Tin Town victims. And this has been a thread throughout her life. She would get involved in struggles in informal settlements, struggles in Chatsworth, where poor people were either being evicted or their services were being taken away from them. My mother was a kind of mantra that dictated to her what she did was perhaps best captured in quite a well-known saying, which goes like this: evil flourishes when reasonable men and women remain silent. And she never remained silent. And whenever evil flourished, and it often flourished in a way that impacted on the poor, she would be there.
Absolutely agree. And I remember the stories, the legendary stories of her involvement in Chatsworth and the Bayview Association, which she helped to start. Certainly very important for our democracy and civil society to have a voice and to find their organizing power. Now, Prof. Mir had no... before we move on to her roots and her different identities, she was someone who started the Phambili High School for African students, which is still open today. In fact, I interviewed someone from that school a couple of months back, and the Khanyisa School Project, which was a bridging program for African children from informal settlements. Why were education projects so important to her?
Well, I think she was an educator. She started life off as an academic, as a teacher. So there was the educator in her. There was the social activist who wanted to uplift the lives of poor people. And she knew that education gave people agency. So all of this translated into various different projects. And the schooling projects you talk about were two very important ones, and they were very dear to her heart. And many, many students went through those schools.
Well, long may that work actually continue. Now, something else that I found very interesting about her and can resonate with, as most of us do, is that she had no personal issues or internal difficulties embracing her Indian roots or Indian origin, her Black African roots, and her belief in Islam. How did this unique identity benefit social cohesion in her various community projects?
Well, I think all of this made her completely acceptable to all she worked with, because regardless of race, color, creed, or religion, because she really was, although she had a very strong Muslim identity, in many ways she was secular. And this resonated with all she came into contact with. On the one hand, she was a conventional, traditional Indian Muslim woman in some ways. On the other hand, she was fiercely independent. And, as I said, no glass ceiling featured in her life. The other thing to say about her, I think why she was so acceptable, she wasn't a pretentious person. Notwithstanding all her academic achievements and all her accolades and the many awards and recognitions she got, she was not a haughty person. She made everybody feel comfortable, and she was actually at heart quite an incredibly down-to-earth person.
I remember that quite clearly interviewing her about Palestine many, many years ago. She was also an astute and a committed activist who would stand in front of bulldozers that were threatening to demolish homes and stand with the market traders. Our market traders, of course, very close to our hearts in terms of their struggle. Was this worrying for your family, Judge Mir?
Oh, absolutely. I think it gave my father very many grey hairs, because whilst she was doing all of those things, I think she was also banned. So she wasn't supposed to be in front of those bulldozers, or she wasn't supposed to be out of the area we lived in. And my father was a lawyer, and he was very cautious and, although very supportive of her, he thought she could be quite reckless. So very often, the only time my father would know that she had been in front of those bulldozers was when he saw it in the newspaper, and he had no idea that she had been there breaking her banning order. So yes, it was a worry to the family, but at the same time, the family was incredibly proud and supportive of her.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of us know what we read about her voraciously online and in books, and I'm sure her personal life is reflective of her public life. But of course, only you would know, and your family would know. What was she like as a family person?
She was incredibly warm, very caring. She was terribly absent-minded. She was very adventurous. She loved painting. She loved building. She was not the most domesticated of mothers. My father and we had a cook. They did the shopping and the cooking, but she could cook up a storm if she wanted to. She enjoyed cooking exotic meals. But, she brought us up to believe that we could achieve anything we wanted to. There were 3 children in the home. I was the middle one, my brother the youngest, and my sister the eldest. And I think the life choices all 3 of us made were very much informed by the kind of mother we had, the influence she had over us, and the values she instilled in us. She was also a very elegant woman. Her saris are legendary. She had a large selection of beautiful saris. And she was also incredibly, I have to say, to the extended family, she was a kind of maternal figure to her siblings, to her grandchildren. I don't think you could have a more fun grandmother than she was. So she gave to all of us in different ways so much.
Such delightful insight and information. We've got a comment from attorney and former acting judge Rehana Khan Parker, who says, Fatima Mir is an iconic woman who serves as an inspiration to many women and men. Shah Mohamed saying, indeed, an iconic woman. Absolutely agree. And since we've got comments from 2 women, let's talk about her role in the empowerment of women. In 1955, of course, Professor Fatima Mir was a founding member of FEDSAW, the Federation of South African Women. The same organization that organized the famous 20,000 women marching against the Dom Pass on the Union buildings with that famous rallying cry, Watinta Bafazi, Watinta Mbokodo, strike the women, strike a rock. Now, I want to quote her words. She said, I carry my past every day in my heart because as a woman, I can't walk freely on the streets. We can't claim our freedom as women in this country. And so we must continue the fight. Judge Mir, what do you think she would have advised women of our country to do about the twin pandemics of gender-based violence and economic inequality, which are still rampant?
I think she would have recognized that these are problems which have to be addressed jointly by men and women alike. These are not just women's issues. I think she would say to women, never let your gender prevent you from being accorded your full respect, dignity, and rights as a human being. Don't allow yourself to become a victor. Find ways of empowering and seeing the light even in the most darkest of situations.
Empowering words indeed. And I want to talk about her work as an artist. So her creative activities stirred our conscience through plays that she wrote, as well as a collection of poignant drawings and paintings that she created while in prison. She smuggled her art out by rolling them up, hiding them in underwear, and passing them to her lawyer during consults. Absolutely brilliant, an act of defiance that we remember till today. Since 2017, this historic art collection is exhibited at our Constitutional Hill Museum. Clearly, she understood creativity is a form of activism. Tell us about her art, and was your family surprised at all with her creativity?
Um, my family is quite an artistic family. Three members of our family are terribly artistic and they produce wonderful works of art. That's my mother, my brother, and my sister. Unfortunately, that gene didn't get passed down to me. I took after my father, both of us were quite unartistic. So no, it was not a surprise to us. My mother always painted, my brother and sister always painted, and I was dragged along on many a trip to many a field to try and capture art and paint. And the others came back with beautiful works of art, and I always felt like the untalented member of the family in the artistic sphere. So she always was an artist. She always produced art. During her imprisonment, she produced 21 paintings, which are now on permanent exhibition at the Constitutional Hill. And these paintings capture the day-to-day life inside the women's jail, both the vicious, institutionalized harshness of apartheid architecture and the intimacy and camaraderie between inmates. I believe that these pictures are the only visual record of the women's jail. So they capture a period of history that we dare not forget. And her brush, she has a very distinctive kind of brush stroke. It looks a little bit like Van Gogh. I think she might have been influenced by Van Gogh. But those paintings are there and they're there for all to see. I have three very beautiful paintings that she did in my chambers, which are of pride of place, and I think every one of her children and grandchildren has some form of artwork that she has produced. And please, yes, I do the grandchildren down. The grandchildren are also very artistic. So that gene went down to the next generation. Every one of her grandchildren are artistic.
Absolutely brilliant. Of course, memory is a weapon and art is an instrument for change. We've got a comment from Dr. Nanda Subin, political cartoonist, and he said, just before she passed away, she was very ill and she insisted on opening my exhibition, which she promised to do months earlier. She was, his book launch actually. She was pushed into the Kwamuhle gallery on a wheelchair accompanied by a nurse. Do you remember this, Judge Mir?
I remember it very well. You know, my mother was incredibly courageous. Now, many of us who would have been struck down and confined to a wheelchair would have not had the confidence to go out in public and to just embrace life in a different form. But she did this with enormous dignity in her wheelchair. She had a wonderful nurse, and the last 8 years of her life was spent fighting the good fight, doing everything she wanted to do, and continuing being an activist. But she was an activist in a wheelchair.
So inspiring. A comment from Nawawi Matthews, last comment before we start rounding up. He says, I will always remember her. She passed away to the other side on my birthday, the 12th of March. May she rest in peace. Absolutely, in all her peace and all her power. Now, you won't be able to see this, Judge Mir, but what we're going to do before we let you go is put onto screen a cartoon by Dr. Nanda Subin as a tribute to Professor Fatima Mir. Sadiq will bring that on screen, and I'm just going to read the caption before we say goodbye to you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, while he does that, and I've got a personal copy in my room if people can see this on camera. So I'm going to read the caption for you. It says, thank you, Auntie Fatima. You helped liberate this country with courage, wisdom, and dignity, without using hate speech and racial diatribes. The only enrichment you sought was the freedom that you fought for. If we called you the mother of the nation, it would have been truly befitting. And this is a Nanda Subin piece in 2010, on the 15th of March in 2010. All right, thank you very much, Judge Yasmin Shehnaz Mir, for joining us on the People's Voice today. And you can see that cartoon in front of your screen right now when you're watching. Thank you for joining us on the People's Voice and sharing the life and the inspiration of one of the greatest political figures and activists that our world has ever seen.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to you and all your listeners.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A brilliant, fascinating, insightful, and interesting conversation with Judge Yasmin Shehnaz Mir in our tribute to Professor Fatima Mir, revolutionary women, the kind of women we should be looking up to in making a difference in our country and our world. What we're going to do next, before we introduce our second guest, who is Nishan Belton, we're going to screen snippets from an SABC Mela tribute to Professor Fatima Mir on the occasion of her 90th birthday. So Sadiq is going to screen for us some snippets from the SABC Mela tribute on Professor Fatima Mir. All right, we apologize for the issues with the audio there. Clearly, the weather in Durban seems to be affecting the audio quality, but you can go and look for that video interview or feature as a tribute to Fatima Mir on the occasion of her 90th birthday. You can find it on YouTube. Look for the SABC Mela channel. It's an 8-minute insert, absolutely fascinating. And it includes an interview with Judge Shehnaz Mir, who we were in conversation with a little while earlier. In the second half of today's show, The People's Voice, we're in conversation with Nishan Belton, who Sadiq is going to bring onto camera for us now. Nishan is the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, a member of Collective Against COVID-19 Corruption, along with the SACC, CASAC, DLPLF, Foundation for Human Rights, and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Nishan Belton, welcome to The People's Voice.
Good evening. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
It's wonderful. It's an honor to have you on. Tell us, what specific factors or events led to this collective being formed?
It's a collective concern around corruption, state capture, and more recently, the issue of COVID-19. Both ourselves and the Council of Churches had issued statements in this regard prior to this collective coming into formation. And the Council of Churches reached out to us to propose that we actually start working on something together with other foundations and other organizations.
Of course, the SA Council of Churches continues to take a leading role in human rights and democracy in our country, together with CASAC, the Desmond Leah Tutu Foundation, FHR, NMF, and of course the AKF, the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. What led to the meeting, Nishan, with Cyril Ramaphosa and other ANC officials on the 24th of August?
Well, surprisingly, it was some mischievous person who changed the heading of our collective statement, and it read as such as if the collective was calling for mass action against the ANC on the issue of corruption. Now, that certainly wasn't the case, but it certainly prompted the ANC to call many of us to get clarity on whether the statement, the heading was in fact correct. And after we corrected that, we were all then very surprised that we were invited to a meeting with the ANC. And I must say that we deliberated at length whether we should have or not have met the ANC. The Council of Churches in particular felt that their membership felt that it was government that we needed to meet and not the governing party. And that was the view of many of us as well. But I think once we were given the assurance that we would be meeting with the governing party, but also with the president of the country as part of that delegation, we thought it an important opportunity to go and meet with them to convey our sentiments about the ANC and corruption, but also to use it as a platform to seek an audience with the president of the country and members of his cabinet.
All right, thank you for the clarity on that. Interesting to know who this mischievous person was. But take us through the tangible outcomes of this meeting, Nishan. Has there been any progress since?
No, well, the meeting was called by the ANC. It was a very frank meeting. It was a very robust meeting. And we only wanted two things out of it. One was to convey our general dismay to the ANC about the issues of corruption, its impact on democracy, its impact on service delivery. But secondly was to use it to seek an audience with government. And we got the assurance from the president that such a meeting would be convened, and we hope that that will be convened within the next week or two at most. Because we certainly think that we have a range of issues to convey to government, as well as recommendations on what we think needs to be done. And that really for us was the major outcome that we were looking for, and we succeeded on that.
All right. So in your statement issued on the 25th of August, the collective has jointly issued a moral call to all who live in South Africa to become vigilant and active citizens and support the democratic project by rejecting corruption and unethical behavior. Nishan, what specific and new actions should women, the poor, and the working class take in the view of the collective?
Well, I think firstly, it's not necessarily for any sector to respond only as a sector. I think we need to understand the corrosive impact of corruption on our entire democracy and I dare say on the economy as a whole. So the impact obviously is felt on the poorest and the most vulnerable within our society. You've seen the impact of this virus, particularly on poor communities who prior to COVID-19 were really struggling to keep food on, to get food onto the table. And with the virus itself coming into being, the ability of government to actually provide food and relief was hampered severely with instances of corruption throughout the country. So our call really would be for all sectors of society to understand, firstly, the impact of corruption. The working class organizations, particularly COSATU, FEDUSA, and SAFTU, have all come out to voice their opposition to this. COSATU has called for a national strike in October in opposition to COVID-19 corruption. But it has also called for other specific measures, very strong on the issue of transparency around procurement information, and that has started to come. It has also made very specific recommendations about the need for legislation that would ensure that family members of those who are in government are prohibited from doing business with government. It has also called for the speeding up of investigations and prosecutions, and lastly has called for the establishment of what they call rapid response courts to deal with COVID-19 corruption. Now, all of the net result of all of this should save the country money if done properly. And ideally,
right. I want to get more into detail in those specific recommendations with you, Nishan, but just reading from a portion of that statement, I quote, "There comes a time when the moral depravity of some in positions of authority and in the private sector undermine the very notion of nationhood and the underlying value of public service. We are compelled to assert, this is not how we shall be known as a nation. We refuse to allow corrupt networks in different provinces to go about their criminal activity, trampling on the rights of honest and law-abiding citizens." I'm particularly interested in the private sector part, whose toxic role in corruption is largely forgotten, or it's hidden by the frontline corruption of politicians. Nishan, how do we hold the private sector to account, given their financial puppet strings?
No, I think we must also recognize that the private sector has been brought to book, not as publicly exposed as it should be. You take just the recent case against Dis-Chem. Dis-Chem was hauled before the Competition Commission for price fixing. They attempted to challenge it, withdrew their challenge, and have now been found guilty. The problem is the legislation has such flimsy fines that Dis-Chem is very much able to pay it without blinking an eye. So there is a need to review, I think, the severity of the punishment that is out there. Hundreds of companies have been found guilty by the Competition Commission. I think that this has not been sufficiently exposed. It is true that there is a huge degree of collusion between elements within the private sector and those who work in the public service to rig the system and to benefit individuals who have in fact set up businesses. But I think it would be incorrect to paint the entire private sector as being guilty of collusion as one would be very wary of saying that all public servants are crooks likewise.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Like civil society demands, the collective has called for three obviously expected things: transparency, accountability, and ethical governance. And to quote from the statement, the collective challenged the ANC leadership, saying the governing party leadership appears compromised within itself, and asserted that if this observation is not corrected with robust evidence, then the public conclusion might inevitably stand that both the moral premise and the constitutional imperative are at risk and are both in danger of collapsing. Nishan, what kind of robust evidence is enough?
Well, this is robust evidence. We were saying that the ANC itself needed to be leading on. And sadly, it didn't do itself a huge amount of positive coverage when it decided to reinstate Zandile Gumede into the provincial legislature, or to reinstate the VBS accused, and there are many others like that. So I think what we were saying to the ANC is that we would only believe their sincerity and commitment when they themselves ensure that the ones who have charges against them are not rewarded with further position. But I think we would also like the ANC to see the ANC themselves laying charges against their own members, and not defending them as they have done in the past, where they have in fact marched to prison gates with people who were going to start serving prison sentences. That's the kind of robustness that I think society demands of a party that has the history and the credentials of the ANC.
On point. Your statement continues, or the statement of the collective, to say that such a breakdown at the level of government and ANC leadership, in my quote, prepares the ground for the moral decay of the rest of society, resulting in the rule of law being undermined. But surely, Nishan, the COVID-19 lockdown corruption has shown us that we're way past that point.
I think it's probably the lowest point that we've come to as a country in terms of just the depravity, the prevalence of corruption. But I don't think that must stop us from doing what is required, or from saying what needs to be done. If we don't stop this now, I think our economy will completely plummet, and whatever hope we might have had to have been graded any lower by the international ratings organizations will be dashed. We still have the IMF loan. There's the solidarity funds that need to be guarded at all costs. So I think there is much to still protect, because if we don't do this, I think that what we're seeing across municipalities in this country is another area that needs to where corruption needs to be stemmed. So we shouldn't be despondent and think that this is something that we cannot reverse, because we could very well end up like failed states like Somalia and others, where there's no government, and services are provided by warlords and everybody else. And I don't think that is what South Africa deserves, or what our history and those who have fought for liberation in this country would be proud of in any particular way.
Absolutely. And of course, that IMF loan is a subject for an entirely different discussion. But let's move on from there. ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule said, famously by now, infamously, tell me of one leader of the ANC who's not done business with government. And the collective responded, we are left aghast by the revelation that all ANC leaders within the official public service or not are doing business with government. Should South Africans be expected to invest trust in that environment? That is the big question, close quote. Here's my question, Nishan. How and why do ACE and others get their arrogant attitude wrong?
I think that the ANC is best placed to answer that question. It's something that I grapple with. But I think it comes from the arrogance of having won a number of elections successively with the majorities that the ANC has had, and its ability to think that it can take South African support for granted, and that perhaps goes to the heart of it. I think, however, that from a civil society perspective, um, we have not mooted strongly enough for party checks and balances. So the implementation of Party Political Funding Act is out there, but I think we need to be much more stronger on how it needs to be implemented and how parties need to be able to account for the kinds of monies that they are receiving. I think, secondly, when it comes to elections, we very rarely talk about the quality of candidates, the scrutiny and the integrity of candidates. We all get hyped up with the kinds of broad messaging, but not on the people who are actually going to be representing the parties in parliament and thereby representing South Africans. So I think as citizens, we need to be more probing and more discerning in terms of how we actually make our political decisions in the end.
All right, and certainly, acts of legislation like the PFM may tell us something very different in opposition to the views of ACE and others. Nishan, the collective has called for accountability and consequences for corruption and crime by the establishment and capacitation of an independent investigative and prosecutorial body with clear, well-defined timeframes. And I quote from the statement, "This, together with the resource provision and the capacitation of law enforcement institutions, should be expedited as part of the necessary measures to enhance public confidence." But Nishan, in an environment where futile wastage would mean that more children fall into pit latrines, more women become victims of gender-based violence, and more people become homeless, how do we ensure through our constitution that this solution or recommendation that the collective has put forward does not become yet more and further futile wastage?
We'll have to make. If we think corruption is a problem and if we think we have to root it out, then the institutions that are now being rebuilt after years of state capture and whose job is to arrest this decline and to recoup much of the public funds, then they obviously need to be funded. Now, our view is that South Africa doesn't need to be pumping billions into the South African Airways, for example. So there are big vanity projects that perhaps would need to be less resourced. I am of the view that we don't need the budgets for the defense force that we currently have. So it's a case of reprioritizing, but fundamentally to ensure that the institutions that need to get these crooks behind bars and to recoup all of our money, and for that money to then be used precisely for the purposes that you have outlined, is paramount. If we don't do that, I don't think we stem the corruption. We don't address the decay in our democracy, and then the very sectors that you have outlined the need for will, I think, be much more severely impacted and for a much more longer period.
All right, I hear you. My concern is this. Someone called Albert Einstein once said that one definition of insanity is to do the same thing expecting a different result. So what I'm interested in knowing is this recommendation on an independent investigative and prosecutorial body with clear timeframes, resource provision, etc., etc. What will it do differently to what's already being done in those fields and sectors currently?
Well, you don't have one national anti-corruption body in South Africa. You have it located in a number of different parts of the criminal justice system. And because you don't have that coherence, you don't have proper strategizing, you don't have proper implementation, monitoring, and so forth. So, and that's the big weakness in the system at the moment. So it's very different from repeating Einstein's often quoted quotation. This is a different approach to the problem, which, again, there are no guarantees, because ultimately it depends not just on the type of organization that's created, but whether it is filled with people who have the right skills, the capacity, and the commitment to do the job.
Where will that leave then, Nishan, institutions like the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks, all of those institutions that are tasked with also dealing with investigating corruption and crime, do they become adjacent to this body that is being recommended, or do they become obsolete?
No, I think it's not talking. Look, a lot of the details around this are not yet clear. This is a call that KSEC in particular have made. They are the ones who are proposing and who are working on the kinds of nuts and bolts. But from what I understand is really much more effective coordination, better information sharing, and ensuring that the kind of weaknesses that are prevalent there are sorted out through the kinds of more effective coordination that in fact is missing at the moment.
All right, KSEC, of course, led by governance expert Lawson Naidu. Ishan, a follow-up meeting is planned between the collective and government, where issues of concern are directed towards governmental issues instead of internal party political issues. And we know from experience that the lines are very much blurred. So it's a noble idea. But given our experiences as a nation over the last 350 years, but specifically the last 26 years, politicians openly say that party is more important than country. Party came before the country. Loyalty to a party is more important than loyalty to a country and its people. So given all of that information that we know has openly been said, and not just said, but displayed to us, should we be, looking at this with rose-tinted glasses, or should we be eagle-eyed and keep an eye on what's going to happen next?
No, we are mindful that we have only been granted an audience with government because there is societal pressure around this issue at this point in time. And that kind of pressure is not something that we think must stop because there is a pending meeting with government. We certainly want to go into the meeting with government, not expecting that we are going to get a huge agreement with all that we would probably be putting forward to it. But let me give you one example of how civil society has made a call. We had called for from the outset of this COVID period. Civil society had called for transparency around procurement information. Initially, government was resistant to that idea. Today, they have come around to it, have started releasing that information, and what the result is, we can actually begin to see who has been getting the tenders at what price and so forth. And we would want to begin to push for that kind of transparency work to be a permanent feature of government. I think, secondly, when we go into this meeting, a key issue for us to discuss is the issue of accountability. Where exactly does the buck stop? Where does the president think the buck should stop? And how do they think they need to be held accountable? So it's those kinds of discussions that we think are important for us to start. And where there are possibilities for civil society to help strengthen whatever government has already got on the table, we would certainly want to support that kind of work. But where it's important for us to tell them that we think their plans and ideas are nonsensical or not feasible, we will likewise take the opportunity to do that. Ultimately, we know that it is societal pressure that will continuously push government in the kinds of direction that we think is required to fix up the mess of this country.
All right, so I think it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on what's going to happen next, because we're looking for authenticity. We want politicians who understand that they're public servants and that they answer to us, not the other way around. Nishan, how can civil society support the collective? In what ways can civil society get involved?
Well, this collective is not a permanent structure. I mean, it came together to make that initial call. It will proceed to meet with government, but each of the respective components work with different formations in civil society. So the groups that we have been working with have come together to and will initiate a campaign around the orange overalls, which is a demand for crooks to be sent to prison, and hopefully before December the 9th, which is International Anti-Corruption Day. We will be announcing a call to South Africans to support that particular call through the wearing of orange masks on Fridays. And we would hope that by the 25th of September is when we would have the biggest display of South Africans wearing orange masks in support of this particular campaign. We are setting up, and this is where we need help, teams of people to scrutinize all of the procurement information that is now being publicly made available. We need the expertise to start unpacking that, to start making sense of it, and then to be able to indicate the shortcomings of that to government. Thirdly, we need people to help us work with calls for public servants, particularly to blow the whistle on corruption. We think that whistleblowing must be an act of national service, national duty, but ordinary citizens and civil society must appreciate the work of whistleblowers. And I think every civil society organization knows of people in the public service, so they need to extend that particular call. And lastly, there will be a range of demonstrations and pickets and marches across the country that we think people must support in their numbers, should the COVID requirements be relaxed and enable us to do that.
All right, ways in which people can get involved as civil society to fight for democracy and human rights and stand out against corruption and maladministration. A comment from Zara Mohamed, who says, Nishan Walton, such an inspiring soul, a true role model for the youth. A comment there for you, Nishan. Thank you very much for joining us on The People's Voice and for being a voice of the people.
No, thank you very much. Much appreciated. Thank you. Bye.
All right, so we've been in conversation there with Nishan Belton, Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, another brilliant show, The People's Voice. And I want to say a thank you to our guests, of course, Judge Yasmin Shehnaz Mir, the second daughter of Professor Fatima Mir, the icon, our listeners and our viewers, as well as the Salam Media team, including Sadiq on technical production this evening. For me, the message is fitting in terms of Professor Fatima Mir's own words. Regardless of how many years we have spent in this life, we must get up and shout. Remember to ask yourself every day, what am I doing to make a difference in my community, my country, and my world? Until next week, revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.